So before we get started talking about Greek mythology and kind of diving into that, we need to talk about what a myth is and its function to society. So I'm going to tell you about what's included in a myth, the sacred myth, establishing order, the ideal, and then entertaining the masses, which is what Greek mythology did. So how are these stories created? That's a question that some of you guys had before, was who made all these Greek mythology stories? And then what is a myth? So myth, the definition is a fictitious or a fictional story or half-truth. And I want you to think about that for a minute. Is something that's half true true? Many cultures have their own myths, and then these stories may be wildly different, but the characteristics are similar. So even if you look at mythology, a lot of you know of Greek mythology or Norse mythology. There's also Egyptian mythology. There's a ton of mythologies out there. I know we're going to be talking about Greek mythology. I know we're going to be talking about Norse mythology. I know we're going to be talking a little bit about Europe and Egypt's mythology. And I think I'm going to try to talk a little bit about Japanese mythology, but I'm not sure. So, what makes it a myth? There's no single author, so this kind of answers some of your questions about Greek mythology. There's not one single author that we can point to and say, this person wrote mythology. So, the story evolves through the telling and retelling of it by many people. So, one of the questions I want you to think about is mythology history? We're going to talk about this on Tuesday, but I want you to think about that. So, the essential elements of a myth needs to have. So most of the time a myth is a religious story or has some sort of religious background. And I don't mean that by it has like a Christian sense or any of that. I mean it goes to describe some of the things that you can't describe, or some of the things that religion today would describe. Now a myth would describe that, or science. Stuff that science would describe, a myth would end up describing that. And if we think about Greek mythology a little bit, all this science discovery never occurred during that time. It was always later. So they didn't have explanations for a lot of the things that we do today. So it offers explanation for the unknown. That's what I just talked about. It establishes something to give answers, because part of our human characteristics is having answers for things. So, and it attempts to answer broad and fundamental questions. Mythology is not really meant to answer specific questions. It's more meant to answer the broad questions of life. So we have legends and folk tales, and that's a little different than a myth. So a myth, legend, and a folk tale are used interchangeably because they same similar characteristics. They are very similar, but myths must have all of the essential elements. If not, then it is a legend or a folk tale. So a myth needs to have all of these elements. It needs to be a religious story, offer explanation for the unknown, attempt to answer a broad question, and part of a larger mythology. Legends are a story handed down through generations with no hard evidence backing it up. All myths are legends, but not all legends are myths. It's kind of like all thumbs are fingers, but not all fingers are thumbs. So I want you to think about that for a second. A story handed down through generations with hard evidence, with no hard evidence backing it up. So that's a kind of a lot of history. It's just these stories that have been passed down with not a whole lot of evidence backing it up. If we look at some of the explorers of the world, we see that they talk about the cyclops and the sea monsters that were out there that didn't really exist, or that the people in Africa didn't have heads, or that the land, the new world, was uninhabited and there was nobody there, or that Marco Polo went to China. There's just some historical stories don't really have a whole lot of evidence backing them up. And especially in the case of Marco Polo, there's almost more evidence against it than there is for it. So when we talk about folk tales, it's a story that is purely fiction. It's not even half true. and is not founded on a particular person, place, or event. So again, myths go to describe kind of the unknown. A folktale isn't really founded on any of that. It's not really meant to describe anything. It's more just for fiction and for fun. So the sacred myth, basically to protect yourself, or the reason why people pray today. So Greeks and Romans were very religious people, and myths defined who people should turn into in times of need. So when you have people struggling, they would often turn to the Greek gods and goddesses, and they needed something to make them feel better when they were looking for answers. So if they were going through a hard time, they would turn to the gods and ask them, "Hey, I need some help," kind of like a prayer today. That was because people don't want to suffer without having any hope. A lot of our core human need is to have hope and to want to have hope that something is going to be better. Also, myths give religious rites or meanings to something and even spawn new rites. And the most common is the ritual of sacrifice. So, sacrifice is talked about a lot in different religions and different mythologies, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in detail. But for right now, I just want you to think about the idea of sacrifice and why might that be not widely used today. So when we looked at the Aztecs, I know it was at the beginning of the year, but when we looked at the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Incas were very violent people that sacrificed a lot. And as we start going through history, we see less of this sacrifice. So I want you to think about why that might be the case. So myths also establish order. It kind of gives people answers, and so you want to create both natural and social order. Natural order means this is the way the world should be, and social order is kind of like a social class, like middle class, high class, low class. So creation begins with chaos if we look at Greek mythology, and myths work to give specific order to the universe, to kind of say how things went. This happened first, and then this happened, and then this happened. We see this in religion as well as we see this in mythology. There's also order created in cosmos or space. So we see the order of the solar system, and we see the order of things that are natural. But they also bring order to lesser beings, so humankind and even society. So it gives power to the people that want to have power. And if you look at mythology, if you want to know what the people were like that wrote it, you just need to look at the people in power. Because most of the time, the people in power were the ones that looked like the people that wrote it. Because the people that wrote it want people of the same skin color, the same interest to be in power. So most myths confirm that Zeus, the ruler of the gods, was responsible for creating order in the natural world. Zeus presided over the affairs of the natural world. He placed the stars and planets in their places and gives rain, snow, thunder, and lightning. So if we look at the solar system, Romans and Greeks believe that Zeus placed everything where it should be. And it kind of gave the Greeks a sense of belonging because, as we know today, there's no water on other planets enough to sustain human life. Remember when we looked at that picture and we looked at the temperature needed to sustain water? Earth was the only planet in that circle. So Greeks wanted a sense of belonging, and they wanted a sense of this is like there's a reason for everything. Okay, well Zeus placed it there because it's perfect. It perfectly revolves around the sun, keeping us warm so we don't freeze to death. It's perfectly placed so we have enough water to drink and live off of for thousands of years. And we also have rain. So if the crops grew, it was because of Zeus. Snow, if it snowed, it was because of Zeus. And even thunder and lightning, it might be because Zeus was mad that day. Now that the universe has been created and under control, the lesser beings needed to understand their roles and rules so they didn't upset the natural order. So Greeks believed that after Zeus organized the solar system, he put people in their roles and set rules so that way it didn't collide with the solar system. Well, it's not really working out for him right now because we're kind of destroying our planet. So the ancient had their own set of rules. They established these through the myths. And we talked about how myths are just stories. So they had to be good storytellers in order for them to be, one, believable, and two, even make sense. But it was said that Zeus established these as well. So even the gods had their own set of rules, and Zeus established those rules. So it's kind of a hierarchy in itself of the gods, and then Zeus sits above that. So when we talk about the ideal, the myths serve to paint a picture of the ideal human behavior and human being. And I want you to think about that for a second and what it means to be ideal human behavior. Like, what does that look like? What does that look like in 2023? Ideal human behavior and the ideal human being. It's not just saying this is how you should act. It's saying this is how you should look. Like, this is the ideal, the perfect person. It was also created to entertain the masses. Ancients enjoyed entertainment just like we do today, only they used oral tradition or telling of the stories. History is a story. We talked about that like the first week of school. History is just one big story. Well, they enjoyed entertaining people, and these stories were very, very interesting. The story of Zeus having multiple affairs, the story of different Greek gods and goddesses. I don't want to get into a whole lot of it because I want to give a chance for Eli and Mason and Bella and Andrew to tell some of those stories because they are definitely a little bit more of an expert on this than I am. But they wanted to tell stories and make it very, very interesting. So since it was mostly spoken stories, different people had different interpretations. And we start seeing that a little later in history, how the traditions of the gods and goddesses kind of shifted based on who was telling the story. And we're going to look at different primary sources and we're going to see how it changed over the years. So, oral tradition is told to people by bards or storytellers well versed in historic tales. Yes, this was a job at the time. You would just be a storyteller. They would come and say, take a seat, and then they would tell you a story. But they were under pressure to grant audiences wishes because they wanted to make money. At the end of the day, this was a business. The same story would vary a bit from myth to myth each time it was told. If you told a story about your weekend and then a week later had to tell the same story, would you leave details out? Not on purpose, but just because you forgot it. If you were telling me how your weekend went, would it be a little different than if you told your best friend? It'd probably be a little different. So that's how myths kind of got their variations. Mythology is a source of entertainment and academic study. At first, it was meant to just entertain you, but everybody started believing these myths and they started believing the ideas behind them. And so it became really, really important to their society. And it says, don't accept myths as literal truths. So I want you to think about why we wouldn't do that and why we don't study them to get answers. Why don't we look at myths as truths. And more or less, there's so many people that believe them in Greek. Why don't we look at these for answers in Greek society? Now, this last point, it says, even so, that doesn't mean we can't find our own truths within the mythological tales. What does that mean, our own truths? I'll give you a second just to think about our own truths. So I believe what it means by this is we're all going through different stuff. Like my life is different than yours, and your life is different than your neighbor's, and so on and so forth. We all have different stuff that we're going through, and we're all searching for different truths at the moment. Me in my life right now, I'm searching for different things than what Lilith is searching for, or Eli, or Cade. With that being said, if we're searching for that, that's what we want to hear. So if I'm searching for more financial security, if I'm don't have enough money, I want to hear a myth that tells me that everything's going to be okay, that Zeus is going to reward me with financial security, and if I do this, this, and this, I will be more well off financially. But what if that's not a worry for you? What if you're already rich? Your truth is a little different than mine. So I want you to think about that, because on Canvas, I want you to start trying to draft a myth. Now, remember, if we go back, a myth is a religious story. Now, yours doesn't have to be a religious story, even though it is an element of a myth. I don't want you to feel that you have to make a religious story by any means. I do want you to try to offer an explanation to something that is unknown. And that unknown can be different than anybody else's in the class. I want you to be able to keep your answers broad. Do not be specific. Remember when we talked about an informational, if you go too specific, then it's not going to impact as many people as you would like. And with mythology, you want to impact as many people as you can. You want to tell a story to the masses. You want everybody to hear. But if you get too specific, it won't matter to a whole lot of people. So I want you to try to come up with a myth. And it doesn't have to be good. I just want you to put effort towards it. It doesn't have to be perfect. We are going to play around with myths and see how we can get it to make a little bit of sense. And at the end, we're going to do something, and I'm not going to tell you yet, but one of our last projects with myths is going to be later down the road. So I don't want you to focus on that. I want you to just focus on getting a rough draft of your myth, and that will be on Canvas. If you get finished with that, there's some things you can do to help you so you're not being a distraction to you or others. You can do any new Zellas that say new. That means you didn't do them. You can pick an IXL and do that. You can work on your fiction writing, which I would like wrapped up a little bit sooner rather than later. I don't know when the deadline is going to be for that. I don't even know if I'm going to make a deadline for it, because we are at so many different spots in our fiction because we had to stop. And I don't want to force this fiction writing to be done, if that makes sense. I want this writing to be more, it comes to you with fiction. Now, mythology, I am going to put a deadline on. We are going to be done with at a certain point. But our fiction writing, I want it to be more come and go. So you can work on that. You could work on your mythology. You could start researching some mythologies. I am not an expert on mythology. I have no idea what I'm talking about, to be honest with you. Eli and Mason and Andrew and Bella, they're pretty good at Greek mythology. So if you have any questions, you can ask them. I want to start diving into different mythologies and trying to connect them. That's my big goal. So go to Canvas, do the assignment. If you have any questions, please email me. I'll be able to answer emails during the day, but I want you to be able to be focused. Remember, stay on task. You guys are awesome. Be ready for NWEA on Tuesday.